She sang in a dead language at karaoke. Every alien veteran stood and saluted. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The neon lights of the stellar crossroads flickered in shades of purple and gold, casting long shadows across the crowded bar where 100 different species mingled in uneasy peace. Emily Parker stood near the entrance, clutching her data pad nervously, wondering if coming here tonight had been a terrible mistake. The Stellar Crossroads was the largest off-world entertainment complex in the entire Outer Rim sector, a massive station that floated in neutral space between three major galactic territories. Here, species from across known space gathered to drink, gamble, trade stories, and occasionally sing badly at the karaoke stage that dominated the central plaza. Emily had arrived on the station 3 months ago as part of a human cultural exchange program, one of only 50 humans living among nearly 10,000 aliens of every imaginable variety. She was 26 years old, with light brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and warm hazel eyes that often seemed to observe more than they revealed. Before volunteering for the exchange program, she had worked as a historical linguist at the University of New Boston, specializing in Dead Earth languages. It was a quiet life, spent mostly in libraries and archives, tracing the evolution of forgotten tongues. Her colleagues had thought she was insane when she applied to live on an alien station for 2 years. Her mother had cried for a week. But Emily had always felt called to bridges, to finding connections between different worlds and times. Tonight was Open Species Karaoke Night, a monthly event where anyone from any world could take the stage and share music from their culture. Emily had attended twice before, watching with fascination as Valorian warriors sang haunting battle hymns, as Kintari dancers performed elaborate vocal ceremonies, as Mordesh traders belted out surprisingly funny drinking songs. She had never considered participating herself, content to observe and learn. But something had changed last week. She had been working in the station's cultural archives, cataloging human contributions to the galactic database, when she stumbled across a restricted file. The file was old, dating back nearly 200 years to the early days of human-alien contact. Inside were records from the Galactic Liberation War, a conflict Emily had only heard whispers about. Humans were relatively new to galactic society, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 180 years ago. The Liberation War had occurred during humanity's first 50 years in space, a desperate struggle against the Cretan Empire, a brutal regime that had enslaved dozens of species across 3 galactic arms. The restricted file contained testimony from alien veterans who had fought alongside human soldiers during the war's final campaigns. Emily spent 3 days reading through the accounts, her heart pounding as she learned what humanity had done, what they had sacrificed. The file mentioned something called the Hymn of Final Dawn, a song that human soldiers had sung before the Battle of Crimson Fields, the turning point of the entire war. According to the testimonies, that song had become legendary among the alien coalition forces. Veterans still remembered it 2 centuries later. But here was the strange part. The song had been sung in Latin. Not the standard English that had become humanity's primary language by the time of space exploration, but ancient Latin, the language of the old Roman Empire. Emily had spent years studying Latin during her academic training. She knew its cadence, its power, its ability to convey both authority and sorrow in equal measure. The file included a partial recording of the hymn. When Emily played it, she felt tears streaming down her face. The voices of long-dead human soldiers rose in perfect harmony, singing words that resonated across centuries. The recording was damaged, cutting out after only 45 seconds, but those 45 seconds changed something fundamental inside her. She needed to sing this song. She needed to remind the galaxy what humanity had done during those dark years. And she needed to do it here, at the Stellar Crossroads, where veterans from 100 species came to remember and forget in equal measure. Emily had spent the last week reconstructing the full hymn from historical records, piecing together fragments from ancient Earth religious texts and military archives. She had practiced alone in her quarters, her voice growing stronger each night. She had contacted the karaoke night organizers, a cheerful Belmorian couple named Vex and Lyra, who had been delighted to add a human performance to the roster. They had asked what song she would sing. When she told them it was from the Liberation War era, their cheerfulness had faded into something more serious. They had simply nodded and added her name to the list. Now, standing in the crowded bar with her datapad clutched tight, Emily wondered if she was truly ready. The Stellar Crossroads was designed as a massive circular plaza with the karaoke stage at the center, surrounded by rings of tables, booths, and standing areas that rose in gentle tiers. The architecture allowed thousands of beings to gather while maintaining clear sight lines to the stage. The current performer was a young Kintari woman singing something upbeat and playful in her native clicking language. The crowd clapped along, tentacles, claws, and hands beating out the rhythm together. Emily found an empty spot near the third tier and ordered a drink from a passing servobot. Her hands were shaking slightly. She told herself it was just nerves. She had sung in front of people before, back in university choir. This was no different. Except it was completely different. This was singing a war hymn in a dead language to an audience of aliens who had actually fought in that war. Some of them might have been there at Crimson Fields. Some of them might have watched their friends die. She sipped her drink, something called a nebula mist that tasted like citrus and starlight, and tried to calm her racing heart. The Kintari woman finished to enthusiastic applause. Vex, the male Belmorian organizer, floated up to the stage. Belmorians were gaseous beings who maintained their shape through specialized containment suits, giving them the appearance of colorful clouds trapped in transparent armor. Vex's suit glowed a warm orange as he addressed the crowd through the translation system that rendered his words intelligible to all species present. Vex announced that the next performer would be Emily Parker, a human, singing a piece from Earth history. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Humans were still relatively rare in this part of space, curiosities more than full members of the galactic community. Some beings leaned forward with interest. Others continued their conversations, uninterested. A few near the back looked actively skeptical. Emily stood, her legs feeling weak. She made her way down the tiers toward the stage, aware of hundreds of eyes, optical clusters, and sensory organs tracking her movement. She climbed the steps to the platform. The lights were bright and hot. Vex handed her the microphone, his gaseous form swirling with encouraging colors. She took it with trembling hands. She looked out at the crowd and felt a wave of dizziness. This had been a mistake. She should leave. She should apologize and run back to her quarters and never attempt anything this foolish again. But then her eyes caught movement near the fourth tier. An elderly Valorian male was leaning forward, his forearms folded across his chest, his scarred face intent. He wore the simple gray wrap that marked him as a veteran of some long-ago conflict. And he was watching her with an expression that Emily could only describe as desperate hope. She realized then that she was not doing this for herself. She was doing this for him, and for all the others like him scattered throughout this crowd. Veterans who remembered when humanity had come from nowhere to stand against impossible evil. Veterans who had fought beside human soldiers and watched them die for the freedom of species they had only just met. Emily raised the microphone to her lips. She had programmed the stage system to play a simple instrumental backing track, just strings and a low drum, based on ancient Earth orchestral traditions. The music began, soft and mournful, building slowly. She closed her eyes and began to sing. The words rose from somewhere deep inside her, in Latin that rolled like thunder and whispered like prayers. She sang of dawn breaking over blood-soaked fields. She sang of soldiers marching to their deaths with eyes wide open. She sang of the moment when hope seems impossible, but you choose it anyway. You choose to stand and fight, because surrender means the death of everything good in the universe. The hymn was structured in 3 verses, each building on the last, each adding layers of meaning. The first verse was about fear, about facing an enemy so vast and terrible that victory seemed like a child's fantasy. The second verse was about brotherhood, about soldiers from different worlds holding the line together, dying together, becoming something greater than the sum of their parts. The third verse was about sacrifice, about the humans who charged into the plasma batteries at Crimson Fields, knowing they would not survive, buying time for the alien fleet to regroup and counterattack. Emily sang with everything she had. Her voice was not perfect. She was not a professional singer, but she sang with absolute conviction, with the weight of 200 years of history, with the souls of those long-dead soldiers flowing through her. She opened her eyes during the second verse and nearly stopped singing. The crowd had gone completely silent. Every conversation had ceased. Every being in the entire plaza was staring at her. And more than that, throughout the crowd, scattered across all the tiers, aliens were standing. Not all of them, but dozens, maybe 100. They rose slowly from their seats or pushed away from tables, their movements stiff, formal. Their faces, regardless of species, carried the same expression, profound recognition mixed with old grief. They were veterans. They had been at Crimson Fields, or at one of the other desperate battles of that war. And they remembered this song. As Emily moved into the third verse, the one about sacrifice, about the final charge, her voice grew stronger. The alien veterans stood at attention, their postures rigid in the military fashion of their various species. A towering Mordash near the front, her 6 legs locked in a position of respect. 3 Valorians in different sections, their arms crossed in the ancient salute of their warrior culture. A pair of Kintari, their tentacles arranged in the ceremonial stance used only for honoring the dead. Even a few species Emily did not recognize, their bodies held in positions that clearly signified deep respect. The karaoke stage had become something else entirely. This was no longer entertainment. This had become a memorial service. Emily sang the final words of the hymn, her voice rising to fill the vast space of the plaza. She sang about how dawn eventually came to Crimson Fields, how the Crescent lines broke, how freedom proved stronger than tyranny. She sang the last word, a single drawn-out note that echoed across the suddenly sacred silence. And then it was over. She lowered the microphone, breathing hard, tears streaming openly down her face. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched. Emily wondered if she had made some terrible cultural mistake, if she had offended these veterans by dredging up painful memories. Then the elderly Valorian on the 4th tier spoke, his voice amplified by the translation system for all to hear. He spoke in his native language first, a series of resonant tones that Emily's translator rendered as this statement. He said that he had fought at Crimson Fields. He said that he had been in the Southern Battery when the human soldiers came charging through the plasma fire. He said he watched them die, every single one, buying 5 minutes that saved 5,000 alien lives. He said he had never forgotten the song they sang as they ran into that fire. And he said that he had never thought he would hear it again in his lifetime, sung by another human in the same ancient language, with the same terrible beauty. The Valorian raised all 4 arms in salute. And then, throughout the plaza, every veteran who was standing brought their hands, claws, tentacles, or appendages to their version of a salute. Different species had different traditions, but the meaning was universal. They were honoring her. They were honoring what she had reminded them of. They were honoring the memory of those who died so that their worlds could be free. The rest of the crowd, realizing what was happening, fell into respectful silence. Some who were not veterans also stood, moved by the moment they were witnessing. Emily stood on the stage, overwhelmed, unable to process what she was seeing. She had expected maybe a polite applause, maybe a few curious questions afterward. She had not expected this. She had not expected to turn a karaoke night into something that felt like a sacred ceremony. Vex floated up beside her, his gaseous form now a deep, reverent purple. He gently took the microphone from her shaking hands and announced that the venue would take a short intermission. His voice was thick with emotion that transcended species. Emily descended from the stage on legs that barely supported her weight. She was immediately surrounded by aliens, not crowding her, but forming a respectful circle. They wanted to speak with her. They wanted to share their stories. The elderly Valorian made his way down from the 4th tier, moving slowly on legs stiffened by age and old wounds. When he reached her, he did something Emily had never seen a Valorian do. He lowered himself to his knees, bringing his scared face level with hers. His 4 eyes, milky with age, fixed on her with intense focus. He spoke in careful, accented English, bypassing the translator for this moment. He told her that his name was Corvin. He told her that he had been 23 years old at Crimson Fields, a junior warrior serving in the Coalition's 7th Fleet. He told her that when the human division received their orders to make the suicide charge, their commander had asked if anyone wished to sing. And they had sung this hymn. All 300 of them, running into certain death, singing in a language none of the aliens understood, but all of them felt in their bones. Corbin told Emily that he had carried the memory of that song for 197 years. He had hummed it to himself in dark moments. He had tried to teach it to his children, but without knowing the words or the language, he could only share the melody. He had thought the song would die with his generation, that no human alive still knew it or cared about it. He told her that what she had done tonight was the greatest gift anyone had ever given him. She had returned something precious that he thought was lost forever. Emily found herself kneeling with him, her hands clasping his upper arms in the traditional Valorian gesture of deep respect. She told him, through tears, that she had not known if anyone would remember. She told him that she had been terrified of singing, and she told him that his words meant more to her than he could possibly understand. They stayed like that for a long moment, human and Valorian, connected across 2 centuries by a song sung in a dead language. Other veterans approached when Corvin finally rose. A Mordash female named Thress, who had been at the Battle of Seven Suns. A Kintari named Fellner, who had served in the Coalition Medical Corps and treated human wounded. A member of a species Emily did not recognize, whose translator rendered his name as something like Bremick, who had been part of the ground assault at the Crescent Fortress world. Each had a story. Each remembered humanity's role in the Liberation War with a reverence that shocked Emily to her core. She had known, intellectually, that humans had fought in the war. What she had not understood was how that sacrifice had been remembered, how it had become part of the cultural fabric of these species' military traditions. Bremick explained something that Emily had never learned in her historical studies. He explained that before humans arrived in galactic space, the Coalition was losing. The Crescent Empire had superior numbers, better technology, and a ruthless willingness to commit genocide against any species that resisted. The Coalition had been fighting for 70 years and had lost more than half their original territory. Entire species had been wiped out. The survivors were exhausted, depleted, and close to surrender. Then humans showed up. Young, naive, with barely functional faster-than-light drives and weapons that were primitive by galactic standards. But they brought something the Coalition had lost: aggressive optimism. Humans looked at the impossible odds and said, in effect, that impossibility was just another problem to solve. They threw themselves into battle with a creativity and ferocity that stunned both allies and enemies. They invented new tactics on the fly. They jury-rigged their inferior technology in ways that should not have worked, but somehow did. They refused to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed inevitable. And most importantly, Bremick said, humans were willing to die for people they had just met. The Coalition species had been fighting to save their own worlds. Humans had no worlds threatened by the Crescent Empire. Earth was far from the conflict zone. But humans fought anyway because they believed that freedom mattered everywhere, that evil should be resisted regardless of whether it personally affected you. The charge at Crimson Fields, Bremick explained, had become a symbol across Coalition space. It represented the moment when the tide turned, when the Crescent Empire learned that the Coalition would not break. After Crimson Fields, the war continued for 3 more years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Coalition pushed forward, world by world, until finally the Crescent Empire collapsed from within. Emily listened to these stories with a growing sense of understanding. She began to realize why her simple karaoke performance had caused such a profound reaction. For these veterans, the hymn was not just a song. It was a distillation of everything they felt about that war, about what humans had meant to them during the darkest period in their species' histories. The intermission ended, but the mood in the stellar crossroads had fundamentally changed. When karaoke resumed, the performances took on a different character. A Valorian warrior sang a battle hymn from his people's tradition, dedicating it to Emily and the memory of the human soldiers at Crimson Fields. A Kintari sang a mourning song for the fallen. Even Vex and Lyra, the Belmorian organizers, performed a traditional remembrance piece from their culture. The evening became a spontaneous memorial, species after species honoring their dead and the bonds forged in war. Emily watched from her seat, overwhelmed by what she had inadvertently created. She had come here thinking she would sing a forgotten song to a mostly indifferent audience. Instead, she had opened a door to collective memory, had reminded an entire community of veterans about why they had fought and what they had lost. Near midnight, station time, Corvin approached her again. He was accompanied by a dozen other veterans, representing 6 different species. They had a request. They wanted to know if Emily would be willing to teach them the words to the hymn, the actual Latin lyrics. They wanted to be able to sing it themselves, to pass it on to their children and grandchildren, to ensure that the memory of Crimson Fields would never fade. Emily agreed immediately. She spent the next 2 hours in a corner of the stellar crossroads, surrounded by alien veterans, teaching them to pronounce Latin words that had not been widely spoken on Earth for nearly 2,000 years. It was difficult. Latin phonetics did not map cleanly onto most alien vocal structures, but they persisted with the same determination they had shown during the war. They practiced each phrase until they could sing it together, their various voices blending into something strange and beautiful. By the time Emily finally returned to her quarters in the early morning hours, she was exhausted but filled with a profound sense of purpose. She had bridged something tonight. She had connected the past to the present, Earth to the wider galaxy, the dead to the living. She collapsed into bed and immediately fell into deep sleep. The next morning, Emily woke to discover that her life had changed. Her personal communication console was flooded with messages, hundreds of them. They came from all over the station, from veterans and non-veterans alike. Some thanked her for the previous night. Some asked questions about human history and the Liberation War. Some requested permission to record her singing the hymn so they could share it with others. Several were from human residents of the station, expressing pride and surprise that one of their own had done something so meaningful. There were also messages from off-station. Apparently, someone had recorded her performance and uploaded it to the Galactic data networks. The recording was spreading rapidly across multiple species' social platforms. Emily watched a version with subtitles in 17 different languages, saw the view counter climbing even as she stared at it. The comments section was filled with reactions in dozens of scripts she could not read, but her translator rendered them into overwhelmingly positive sentiment. She had gone viral, in the galactic sense. Emily felt a surge of panic. She was a historian and linguist, not a performer or public figure. She did not want fame. She just wanted to honor the memory of those soldiers and share a beautiful piece of history. But as she read through more messages, she began to understand that this was bigger than her personal comfort. Veterans across coalition space were responding to the hymn with the same profound emotion that she had witnessed last night. For many, it was awakening memories they had tried to bury. For others, it was providing a sense of closure they had never achieved. For the younger generations who had grown up in the peace that the war had purchased, it was their first real understanding of what their grandparents had lived through. One message in particular caught Emily's attention. It came from someone named Admiral Renkier, a high-ranking Valorian officer in the Coalition Defense Force. He wrote that he had been a young soldier during the Liberation War and had fought in several battles alongside human units. He explained that the Coalition military had largely forgotten the specific contributions humanity made during the conflict. The war had ended nearly 2 centuries ago, and as peace stretched on, the details faded. New generations of officers learned about the war in broad strategic terms, but lost the personal stories, the cultural touchstones, the emotional truth of what it meant. Admiral Renkier wrote that Emily's performance had reminded him and many other senior officers about an important gap in their historical education. He was formally requesting that Emily assist the Coalition Defense Force in developing educational materials about human contributions to the Liberation War, specifically focusing on the cultural and emotional dimensions that traditional military history often overlooked. Emily stared at the message for a long time. This was an opportunity to do exactly what she loved, making historical knowledge accessible, building bridges between cultures and eras. But it was also terrifying. She would be stepping into a significant public role, becoming a spokesperson for human history in a context she barely understood. She decided to take a walk around the station to clear her head and think about how to respond. The stellar crossroads was a marvel of engineering. The entire structure was nearly 20 kilometers in diameter, a massive torus that rotated to provide artificial gravity. The outer ring contained residential areas, shops, and smaller entertainment venues. The middle rings held the major plazas, including the one where last night's karaoke had taken place. The inner ring housed the station's operational systems and docking facilities. Emily walked along one of the main promenades in the middle ring, watching the flow of alien life around her. Valorians strode past on their 4 powerful legs. Kentari glided smoothly on their tentacles. Mordesh skittered by on their 6 insectoid limbs. Belmorians floated through the crowds in their containment suits. And scattered among them were a handful of humans, still rare enough to draw second glances. As she walked, Emily noticed something different today. Aliens were recognizing her. A young Valorian couple stopped her to thank her for the performance. A Mordesh trader offered her a free sample of his goods, saying it was an honor to meet her. A group of Kentari students asked if they could take a photograph with her. Emily felt deeply uncomfortable with the attention, but tried to be gracious. She found a quiet cafe overlooking one of the station's internal parks and ordered a coffee, one of the few Earth beverages that the station's food synthesizers could replicate reasonably well. She sat by the window, watching small maintenance drones tend to the alien plants below, and tried to organize her thoughts. The truth was that Emily had always been more comfortable with the dead than the living. History was safe. The people she studied could not disappoint her, could not judge her, could not demand things from her. She had chosen linguistics and historical research precisely because it allowed her to explore human experience while maintaining emotional distance. But last night had shattered that distance. She had touched something raw and real, had connected with living beings in a way that pure scholarship never achieved. And as frightening as that was, it also felt right. It felt like this was what she was supposed to be doing. Her communicator chimed. Another message, this one from an address she did not recognize. She opened it cautiously. The message was from someone named Dr. Kelsara Van, a professor of military history at the Coalition Academy on the Valorian homeworld. Dr. Van explained that she had been studying the Liberation War for 40 years and had specialized in human tactical doctrine during the conflict. She wrote that Emily's performance had answered a question that had puzzled her for decades. Dr. Van had found references in multiple sources to a song that human soldiers sang, particularly before high-risk operations. Veterans mentioned it in their testimonies. Battlefield recordings sometimes captured fragments of it. But Dr. Van had never been able to identify the song or understand its significance. She had assumed it was some kind of military anthem in standard English. The revelation that it was actually an ancient hymn in a dead Earth language changed her entire understanding of human cultural psychology during the war. Dr. Van wanted to meet Emily, to interview her about the hymn and its historical context. She offered to cover all travel expenses if Emily would be willing to come to the Valorian homeworld for a symposium on Liberation War history that was scheduled in 3 months. Emily read the message twice, her heart racing. This was exactly the kind of scholarly work she loved. But it would mean stepping even further into the public role she was already feeling overwhelmed by. She drafted a response, accepting Dr. Ven's invitation, but explaining that she was still processing the unexpected attention from last night's performance. She sent the message before she could second-guess herself. Over the next few days, Emily settled into a strange new routine. She continued her normal work in the cultural archives, but now she was also fielding constant requests for interviews, recordings, and public appearances. She tried to maintain boundaries, accepting only the requests that aligned with her values and declining anything that felt too commercial or exploitative. She recorded an official version of the hymn at the request of the Coalition Veterans Association, donating it freely to their archives. She wrote a detailed article about the hymn's historical origins and its use during the Liberation War, publishing it in an open-access academic journal. She agreed to give a lecture at the station's community center about Latin and its role in Earth's cultural history. But she turned down dozens of other requests. No, she would not perform the hymn at a corporate event. No, she would not sell exclusive rights to the recording. No, she would not endorse products or appear in advertisements. The hymn was not hers to monetize. It belonged to the memory of those who died singing it. Emily also made it a priority to connect with the human community on the station. There were 43 other humans living at the Stellar Crossroads, and she had only known a handful of them before last week. Now she reached out, organizing a gathering at a small restaurant that served Earth-style food. 27 humans showed up, ranging from young students to middle-aged professionals to a few retirees. They shared their reactions to Emily's performance and the subsequent media attention. Some were proud, feeling that Emily had represented humanity well. Others were concerned, worrying that she had raised expectations that humans could not meet. A few were simply curious about the history she had uncovered. One man, a maintenance worker named Caleb Walker who had been on the station for 5 years, told a story that silenced the room. He said that when he first arrived, he had experienced subtle discrimination from some alien workers. Nothing overt, nothing he could report, just a sense that humans were seen as the new kids who had not earned their place yet. But after Emily's performance, that changed. Aliens who had barely acknowledged him before now greeted him with respect. One elderly Valorian who worked in his section had clasped his shoulder and said that any species capable of producing that him was worthy of standing alongside the Coalition's finest. Caleb said, with emotion in his voice, that Emily had given him something he did not know he needed: pride in being human in a galactic context. He thanked her for reminding everyone, including humans themselves, that their species had earned its place among the stars through blood and sacrifice. Emily felt tears stinging her eyes. This was why the hymn mattered, not for fame or recognition, but because it gave people a sense of connection to something larger than themselves. After the gathering, Emily walked back to her quarters with a woman named Sarah Morgan, another cultural exchange participant who worked in xenobiology. Sarah was a few years older than Emily, with red hair and a direct manner of speaking. Sarah told Emily something important. She said that humans in galactic space often felt like they were constantly trying to prove themselves, to show that they belonged despite being relative newcomers. The major species had thousands of years of spacefaring history. They had technologies and cultural achievements that humanity could barely comprehend. It was easy for humans to feel inferior, to think of themselves as lucky primitives who stumbled into a community far more advanced than they could ever hope to be. But Sarah said that Emily had revealed something different. She had shown that humanity had already proven itself in the most fundamental way possible. Humans had fought and died for the freedom of species they barely knew. They had stood against evil when it would have been safer to stay home. They had contributed something essential to the galaxy's survival. That was a form of value that transcended technology or cultural sophistication. Sarah said that every human in the galaxy needed to know the stories Emily was uncovering. They needed to understand their own history, their own significance. Because without that understanding, humans would always feel like imposters in galactic society. Emily realized that Sarah was right. Her work was not just about honoring the past. It was about shaping how humans understood themselves in the present and future. The weeks that followed were intense. Emily divided her time between her archive work, her new historical research into the Liberation War, and the various commitments she had accepted. She started a weekly study group at the station, teaching basic Latin to anyone interested in understanding the hymn's original language. To her surprise, 37 beings signed up, including veterans, students, and curious civilians from a dozen species. Teaching Latin to aliens was one of the strangest experiences of Emily's life. She had to adapt her methods constantly, finding ways to explain phonetics and grammar to beings whose vocal structures and cognitive patterns differed radically from humans. But the students were dedicated, motivated by a genuine desire to connect with this piece of history. Corvin, the elderly Valorian veteran, was her most devoted student. He attended every session, taking meticulous notes with all 4 hands, practicing pronunciation until his throat was sore. He told Emily that learning the hymn's words was the closest he could come to honoring the humans who died at Crimson Fields. He wanted to be able to sing it at the annual Liberation War Memorial on his homeworld, to teach it to the younger generation of Valorian warriors. Emily also began working with Admiral Renkier and his staff on the educational materials he had requested. She traveled to the Coalition Defense Force headquarters on a nearby military station, where she spent 3 days consulting with historians, tacticians, and cultural experts. Together, they developed a comprehensive program that would be integrated into officer training across the coalition fleet. The program focused on cultural awareness and historical empathy, teaching young officers to understand the non-tactical dimensions of warfare. Emily's contribution was a module specifically about human cultural psychology during the Liberation War, examining how human values, artistic traditions, and philosophical frameworks shaped their approach to combat. She used the hymn as a central case study. She explained that the choice to sing in Latin, rather than contemporary English, was significant. Latin represented continuity with ancient Earth traditions of honor, sacrifice, and duty. It connected those soldiers at Crimson Fields to Roman legionaries, to medieval knights, to all the warriors throughout human history who had faced death for principles they believed in. By singing in Latin, those soldiers were claiming their place in a long lineage of people who chose courage over safety. The coalition officers found this fascinating. Most alien species did not have this same relationship with their ancient past. For various reasons, their cultures had made cleaner breaks with historical traditions. The idea that humans would reach back 2,000 years to find the right language for a moment of sacrifice was alien in itself, in the most literal sense. Admiral Renkier told Emily that this kind of insight was exactly what the coalition military needed. He said that understanding your allies' cultural frameworks was just as important as understanding their tactical capabilities. He thanked her for helping to fill a critical gap in their education. 2 months after the karaoke performance, Emily received an invitation that made her heart skip a beat. The Valorian government was holding a special ceremony at the Crimson Fields Memorial Site, and they wanted her to attend as an honored guest. Moreover, they wanted her to sing the hymn again, this time at the actual location where the battle had occurred. Emily stared at the invitation, feeling a mix of excitement and terror. Crimson Fields was sacred ground for multiple species. The memorial site drew millions of visitors each year. To perform there would be to step into the most significant possible spotlight. But it would also be a way to close the circle, to bring the hymn back to the place where it had first been sung in combat. She accepted the invitation. The journey to the Valorian homeworld took 4 days via standard commercial transport. Emily traveled alone, using the time to prepare mentally for what was coming. She practiced the hymn daily, ensuring that her voice would be strong enough for an outdoor performance. She also studied everything she could find about the Battle of Crimson Fields, wanting to understand the context as deeply as possible. The battle had occurred on a planet called Valoris Prime, the Valorian homeworld. The Cretan Empire had launched a massive invasion, intending to break the coalition by conquering one of its founding species. The Valorians had fought desperately, but the Cretan forces were overwhelming. The coalition fleet was scattered across multiple sectors, unable to concentrate enough ships to repel the invasion. Then 3 human battle groups arrived, responding to a distress call. The human ships were outmatched, their weapons and shields inferior to Cretan technology. But the human commanders saw an opportunity. If they could buy time for the coalition fleet to regroup, the battle could be turned. The plan was suicidal. A ground assault on the Cretan artillery positions that were bombarding the Valorian capital city. The artillery was protected by plasma batteries and shield generators. Any ground force attempting to breach those defenses would be annihilated. But if the artillery could be silenced for even a few minutes, the coalition fleet would have a window to make a coordinated attack. 300 human soldiers volunteered for the assault. They were from all branches of Earth's military, all backgrounds, all ages. The youngest was 19 years old. The oldest was 57. They represented the full diversity of humanity, men and women of every ethnicity, speaking dozens of Earth languages, following different religions and philosophies. But when their commander asked if anyone wanted to sing before the assault, they chose to sing together in Latin, because Latin was not any particular group's language anymore. It belonged to history, to the deep roots of human civilization. It was a language that could unite them all in that final moment. They sang the hymn of final dawn as they charged across the crimson earth of that alien world. They sang as the plasma fire cut them down. They sang until there was no one left to sing. And they bought 5 minutes. 5 minutes for the coalition fleet to strike. 5 minutes that saved millions of Valorian lives and turned the tide of the entire war. Emily read these details with tears streaming down her face. She understood now why the hymn mattered so much. It was not just a song. It was the last testament of 300 people who chose love over fear, sacrifice over survival. When Emily's transport finally entered orbit around Valoris Prime, she pressed her face to the viewport and stared down at the planet below. The crimson earth that gave the battlefield its name was visible even from space, a vast reddish plain on the northern continent. The Valorian capital city, now rebuilt and thriving, sprawled nearby. She was met at the spaceport by a delegation that included Admiral Rankier, Professor Kelsaravan, and 3 elderly Valorian veterans who had fought at Crimson Fields. They greeted her with deep respect, treating her like visiting royalty. Emily felt overwhelmed by the attention but tried to remain gracious. They escorted her to a hotel in the capital city, where she spent the night trying unsuccessfully to sleep. Her mind kept running through everything that could go wrong tomorrow. What if her voice failed? What if she forgot the words? What if the performance did not live up to the expectations of the thousands of beings who would be watching? But underneath the anxiety was something else. A sense of rightness. A feeling that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The next morning, Emily dressed in simple formal clothes, black pants and a white shirt, no decorations or jewelry. This was not about her. This was about honoring those who died. Admiral Rankier arrived to escort her to the memorial site, accompanied by a security detail that seemed excessive for a woman who was just going to sing a song. The ride to Crimson Fields took an hour by air transport. Emily watched the landscape pass below, seeing Valorian cities and farms, forests of alien trees with purple leaves, rivers that glowed faintly with bioluminescence. This was a beautiful world. 300 humans had died to keep it free. As they approached the memorial site, Emily saw the crowds. Thousands of beings had gathered, maybe tens of thousands. The memorial itself was a massive structure, a wall of polished black stone inscribed with names. Human names, Valorian names, Kintari names, Mordesh names, all the species that had fought and died here. At the center of the wall was a sculpture, a human soldier and a Valorian warrior standing back to back, weapons raised, defending each other. Emily stared at it as they landed, feeling the weight of 2 centuries pressing down on her. Admiral Rankier guided her through the crowds to a staging area behind the memorial. She could hear the murmur of thousands of conversations, a mix of languages and speech patterns that her translator rendered as a low rumble. There were veterans here, wearing their service markers. There were families who had lost ancestors in the battle. There were young students learning about history. There were civilians who simply wanted to pay respects. And there were humans. Emily was startled to see how many. Hundreds of them, gathered in groups throughout the crowd. When had so many humans come to Valoris Prime? She learned later that word of her performance had spread through human communities across the sector, and people had arranged travel specifically to be here. They wanted to witness this moment, to be part of reclaiming their species' history. The ceremony began with traditional Valorian rituals, speeches from government officials and military leaders. Emily stood backstage, her heart pounding, barely processing the words. Then Admiral Rankier stepped to the podium and announced that they had a special guest, a human woman who had rediscovered a song that had been nearly forgotten. Emily walked out onto the stage. The crowd fell silent. Thousands of eyes watched her. She approached the microphone, her legs shaking, and looked out at the sea of faces. And then she looked past the crowd to the crimson earth beyond, the battlefield where so much blood had been spilled. She thought about the 300 soldiers who had run across that ground singing these words. She thought about Corvin and all the other veterans who had carried the memory of that song for 2 centuries. She thought about her own species, still finding its place in galactic society, still learning what it meant to be part of something larger than itself. Emily began to sing. Her voice carried across the memorial site, amplified by the sound system but requiring no artificial enhancement. She sang in Latin, each word clear and precise, each phrase weighted with meaning. She sang the first verse about fear and impossible odds. She sang the second verse about brotherhood across species lines. She sang the third verse about sacrifice and the choice to die for others. As she sang, something remarkable happened. Throughout the crowd, the veterans who had been standing at the stellar crossroads that night weeks ago were here too. Many of them had traveled from distant worlds to attend this ceremony, and they had brought others. They had taught the hymn to fellow veterans, to family members, to anyone who would listen. Now, as Emily sang, other voices joined her. At first just a few, tentative and uncertain. Then more. Then hundreds. Veterans and non-veterans, Valorians and Kintari and Mordesh and humans, all singing together in Latin, a language that most of them had only learned in the past few weeks. The pronunciation was not perfect. The different species' vocal structures produced sounds that were sometimes barely recognizable. But the intent was clear. They were singing together across species lines, just as their grandparents had fought together 2 centuries ago. Emily felt her voice strengthen, supported by the chorus rising from the crowd. She had started this performance alone, but she was not alone anymore. She was part of something vast and powerful, a moment of collective remembering that transcended individual identity. When she reached the final verse, the verse about sacrifice and dawn breaking over crimson fields, her voice rose to its highest point. And in that moment, she understood something profound. The hymn was not about death. It was about what comes after death, about the world that sacrifice makes possible. Those 300 soldiers had not sung about dying. They had sung about the dawn they would never see, but knew would come. Emily sang the last word and let it fade into silence. For a long moment, no sound came from the crowd of thousands. Then, slowly, a single Valorian veteran near the front began to clap. Then another. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Then the entire crowd was applauding, a thunder of appreciation in the ancient forms of their various cultures. Humans clapped with their hands. Valorians struck their forearms together in rhythmic patterns. Kintari created harmonics with their tentacles. Mordesh beat their legs against the ground. Emily stood there, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the response. She had done it. She had brought the hymn back to the place where it was born. She had closed the circle. After the ceremony, Emily spent hours meeting with people who wanted to thank her or share their stories. She spoke with descendants of soldiers who died at Crimson Fields. She met historians and teachers who wanted to incorporate the hymn into their educational programs. She embraced elderly veterans who wept openly as they told her what the song meant to them. One interaction stood out. A young Valorian woman, no more than 20 years old, approached Emily shyly. She explained that her great-great-grandfather had fought at Crimson Fields and had been saved by a human soldier who died protecting him. Her family had honored that human's memory for 5 generations, but they had never known his name. The military records were incomplete, casualties too numerous to track perfectly. The young woman asked if Emily thought it was okay to sing the hymn for an unknown soldier, for someone whose name she would never know but whose sacrifice had made her existence possible. Emily took the woman's hands and told her that the hymn was for exactly that purpose. It was for all of them, named and unnamed, remembered and forgotten. It was a promise that their sacrifice would not disappear into the silence of history. The young Valorian woman nodded, tears tracking down her face, and thanked Emily in a whisper. That night, Emily attended a formal dinner hosted by the Valorian government. She sat at a table with Admiral Renkier, Professor Vin, and several senior military officials from different species. The conversation was fascinating, ranging from historical analysis to cultural philosophy to the practical challenges of maintaining a multi-species military alliance. Professor Vin asked Emily a question that she had been pondering herself. Why Latin? What was it about that specific language that made it the right choice for that moment? Emily thought carefully before answering. She explained that Latin had a quality that was hard to define, but easy to feel. It was a language of empire and of church, of conquest and of prayer, of law and of poetry. It contained within itself the full range of human civilization's highest and lowest moments. When you sang in Latin, you were tapping into 2,000 years of human experience, claiming kinship with everyone who had ever faced death and chosen to meet it with dignity. She said that the soldiers at Crimson Fields, by singing in Latin rather than their native contemporary languages, were making a statement. They were saying that this moment transcended their individual nationalities and backgrounds. They were acting as representatives of the entire human species, of the entire sweep of human history. They were connecting themselves to every warrior who had ever stood in defense of something good. Admiral Renkier nodded thoughtfully. He said that this kind of cultural depth was something the Coalition had lost in some ways. Many species had become so focused on technological and economic progress that they had forgotten the power of historical continuity. Humans, despite being the newest spacefaring species, had maintained something ancient and valuable. The dinner continued late into the night, with increasingly philosophical discussions about the nature of sacrifice, the role of culture in warfare, and the ways that memory shapes identity. Emily finally returned to her hotel in the early morning hours, exhausted but deeply satisfied. She had done something meaningful here. She had built a bridge not just between past and present, but between human and alien, between individual sacrifice and collective memory. The next day, Emily toured the Crimson Fields battlefield with Corvin and several other veterans as her guides. They walked her across the Crimson Earth, showing her where different units had been positioned, where the plasma batteries had stood, where the human soldiers had made their final charge. Corvin stopped at one point and gestured to a section of ground that looked no different from any other. He said that this was where he had been standing when the humans came through. He said that he could still see them in his mind, 300 figures running through the fire, singing that incomprehensible song, dying one by one but never stopping. He said that he had asked himself every day since then whether he had earned what they gave him. Had he lived a life worthy of their sacrifice? Had he used the freedom they purchased wisely? He had tried. He had served in the military for 40 years after the war. He had raised children who grew up to be good people. He had tried to be kind, to be brave, to be the kind of person who deserved to survive when so many others did not. Emily told him, with absolute conviction, that they would be proud of him. That was what the sacrifice was for, so that people like him could live full lives, raise families, grow old. The point was not that he had to be perfect. The point was that he had the chance to be human, or Valorian, or whatever his species was called in English. The point was that he had freedom, and he had used it. Corvin embraced her, his 4 arms wrapping around her in a gesture that transcended species boundaries. They stood like that on the Crimson Earth where so many had died, 2 people from different worlds connected by memory and gratitude. Emily spent 3 more days on Valoris Prime, conducting interviews for her research, meeting with educational institutions, and participating in various cultural events. Everywhere she went, she was treated with respect bordering on reverence. It made her uncomfortable, but she understood that it was not really about her. She was a symbol, a living connection to the past and to the species that had helped save their worlds. When it was finally time to leave, Emily stood in the spaceport looking back at the planet below. She had arrived here feeling uncertain and overwhelmed. She was leaving with a profound sense of purpose. This work, recovering and sharing the cultural history of humanity's early years in galactic space, was what she was meant to do. The journey back to the stellar crossroads gave Emily time to process everything that had happened. She realized that her life had been fundamentally redirected by a single impulsive decision to sing at a karaoke night. She had thought she was just sharing a pretty song. Instead, she had tapped into something much deeper. The collective memory of trauma and triumph, the bonds forged in war, the ways that culture and identity persist across centuries. She also realized that she could not go back to her quiet life in the archives. Not entirely. She had responsibilities now, to the veterans who were counting on her to preserve their stories, to the humans across galactic space who needed to understand their own history, to the broader coalition society that was hungry for cross-cultural understanding. When Emily arrived back at the stellar crossroads, she was greeted like a celebrity. The station had been following her journey to Valoris Prime, and many residents had watched recordings of the memorial ceremony. They treated her arrival as a homecoming. But Emily was ready for this now. She had learned how to navigate the attention without losing herself in it. She thanked people graciously but firmly maintained her boundaries. She agreed to do a few more interviews and presentations, but only ones that served her larger educational goals. She also made a decision about her future. She contacted the Cultural Exchange Program administrators and requested an extension of her stay on the station. Then she reached out to Admiral Renkier and Professor Van with a proposal. She wanted to create a comprehensive historical archive focusing on cultural aspects of the Liberation War, with particular attention to human contributions. She wanted to interview surviving veterans, collect oral histories, analyze primary documents, and create educational materials that would be freely available across Coalition space. Both Admiral Renkier and Professor Vin responded enthusiastically. The Coalition Defense Force agreed to provide funding for the project. The Valorian government offered institutional support. Several universities expressed interest in partnering with her. Within 2 months, Emily had established the Liberation War Cultural Archive, headquartered on the stellar crossroads, but with partnerships across a dozen worlds. She hired a small staff, including 2 other human historians, 3 alien researchers with expertise in their own species' war histories, and a team of translators and archivists. The work was immense. The Liberation War had lasted nearly a century, involved hundreds of species, and touched almost every inhabited star system in Coalition space. The volume of material to collect and analyze was staggering, but Emily approached it with the same methodical dedication she had applied to her linguistic research. She traveled constantly, visiting different worlds to conduct interviews with elderly veterans before their memories were lost. She spent weeks at a time in military archives, reading through after-action reports and personal journals. She collaborated with alien researchers to understand how different species experienced and remembered the war. And she continued to sing, not as a performer, but as a teacher. She held workshops across Coalition space, teaching the hymn of Final Dawn to anyone interested. Veterans, students, teachers, civilians. She taught them the Latin words, explained the historical context, shared the stories of the people who had sung it at Crimson Fields. The hymn spread. It became part of memorial ceremonies on dozens of worlds. Schools taught it as part of their history curriculum. Military units from multiple species learned to sing it together during training exercises. It evolved from a forgotten human song into a shared cultural artifact of the entire coalition. 5 years after that first karaoke performance, Emily stood once again on the stellar crossroads stage. But this time, she was not performing. She was introducing the premiere of a documentary about the Liberation War, created by her archive team. The documentary took a cultural approach to the conflict, focusing on the personal stories, the emotional experiences, the ways that different species had come together to resist tyranny. The hymn of Final Dawn featured prominently in the documentary. Emily had found recordings of the original human soldiers singing it before the battle. She had interviewed survivors who remembered hearing it. She had captured footage of modern multi-species military units singing it together. The documentary showed how a single song had become a thread connecting past and present, human and alien, sacrifice and survival. The premiere was attended by dignitaries from across Coalition space. But more importantly, it was attended by hundreds of ordinary beings who wanted to understand their own history better. Emily watched as the documentary played, saw tears streaming down faces of 100 different species, felt the collective emotion filling the plaza. When the documentary ended, the audience rose in spontaneous applause. Emily took the stage briefly to thank everyone who had contributed to the project. She looked out at the crowd and saw Corvin in the front row, now nearly 2 centuries old, his body failing, but his mind still sharp. He raised all 4 arms in salute, and Emily saluted back. After the premiere, Emily returned to her office in the archive facility. She had a meeting scheduled with a young human researcher who wanted to join her team. The researcher's name was Jordan Pierce, a recent graduate with degrees in both history and xenosociology. Jordan was passionate about cultural bridge building and saw the archive as the perfect place to develop those skills. Emily interviewed Jordan for 2 hours, asking about research experience, language abilities, cultural sensitivity, and personal motivation. Jordan answered thoughtfully, clearly having prepared extensively for this meeting. At the end of the interview, Emily asked one final question. Why did Jordan think this work mattered? What was the point of digging up old stories about a war that ended 2 centuries ago? Jordan paused, considering the question carefully. Then Jordan said that history was not really about the past. It was about the present and future. The stories people told about where they came from shaped how they understood themselves, and how they treated others. If humans in galactic space did not know their own history, they would always feel like outsiders, like they did not quite belong. But if they understood what their ancestors had sacrificed, if they knew that humanity had earned its place through blood and courage, they would walk with more confidence, with more pride, with more connection to the broader galactic community. Emily smiled. Jordan understood. She offered the position on the spot. Over the following years, Emily's archive grew in scope and influence. It became the primary source for cultural history of the Liberation War, referenced by scholars across Coalition space. The archive's educational materials were used in schools from the Valorian homeworld to the outer reaches of Kintari territory. The oral history collection contained thousands of interviews with veterans from dozens of species. Emily herself became a recognized expert on cross-cultural memory and historical trauma. She published numerous academic papers, advised government committees, and consulted on memorial design projects. She trained a generation of young researchers in the methods of cultural history. But her proudest achievement remained the hymn. Everywhere she went, she encountered people who had learned it, who sang it at remembrance ceremonies, who taught it to their children. The hymn of Final Dawn had become exactly what those 300 soldiers at Crimson Fields would have wanted, a promise that their sacrifice would not be forgotten, that the dawn they died to bring would continue to rise. 20 years after that first karaoke performance, Emily attended a ceremony at the Stellar Crossroads commemorating the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Crimson Fields. She was now in her mid-40s, her brown hair showing strands of gray, her face carrying lines that spoke of years spent in intense concentration and deep emotion. The ceremony was enormous, attended by thousands of beings from across Coalition space. There were speeches, military demonstrations, artistic performances, and historical exhibitions. Emily sat in the place of honor, surrounded by the few surviving veterans of the war, all now impossibly old, but still alert enough to understand what was happening. The ceremony's climax was a musical performance. A choir had been assembled, representing every species that fought in the Liberation War. 300 voices, one for each human soldier who died at Crimson Fields. They had practiced for months, learning to blend their radically different vocal structures into something resembling harmony. The choir sang the hymn of Final Dawn in Latin, just as those soldiers had sung it 2 centuries before. But this version was different. It was slower, more elaborate, arranged by a renowned Kintari composer into something that honored the original while elevating it into high art. The Valorian voices provided a deep bass foundation. The Kintari harmonics created complex overtones. The human voices carried the melody. The Mordesh percussion added rhythmic complexity. The Belmorian instruments, played by remote manipulation from their containment suits, filled the spaces between phrases with delicate beauty. The combined effect was staggering. The hymn had always been powerful in its simple, raw form. But this version was transcendent. It captured not just the original sacrifice, but the entire arc of history that followed. The victory won, the peace established, the bonds formed across species lines, the civilization built on the foundation of that blood-soaked crimson earth. Emily listened with tears streaming down her face. She glanced at Corvin beside her and saw that he was weeping openly, all 4 of his arms trembling with emotion. The other elderly veterans in the row were similarly affected. They were hearing their youth, their war, their lost friends remembered in the most beautiful possible way. When the hymn ended, the silence was absolute. 10,000 beings held their breath, suspended in the moment. Then Corvin stood. It took him a long time, his aged body protesting, but he made it to his feet. He brought all 4 arms up in the ancient Valorian salute. One by one, every veteran in the plaza stood. Humans and Valorians and Kintari and Mordesh and species Emily did not even recognize. They rose from their seats or pushed up from their positions, bodies failing, but wills still strong. And they saluted, each in the manner of their species, each honoring the memory of those who had given everything so that this moment could exist. And then the non-veterans began standing, young beings who had never known war, who had grown up in the peace that the Liberation War had purchased. They stood not in salute but in respect, acknowledging the price that had been paid for their lives. Within moments, Every being in the plaza was on their feet. 10,000 individuals from 100 species, standing together in shared memory and gratitude. Emily stood as well, not as a historian or cultural expert or anything official, just as a human being who had accidentally become a bridge between past and present, who had carried a song from the depths of history into the light of the current moment. The moment stretched. No one wanted to break the spell. This was one of those rare instances when an entire community felt the same thing at the same time, when individual identity dissolved into collective experience. Finally, after what felt like forever, an elderly Kintari veteran near the front spoke. His voice was weak with age, but his translator rendered it clearly for all to hear. He said simply, "They are remembered," and 10,000 voices responded as one, "They are remembered." The ceremony ended soon after. There was nothing more that needed to be said or done. The memory had been honored. The promise had been kept. Emily made her way slowly through the crowd, accepting embraces and handshakes and tentacle touches from people who wanted to thank her for her work. But she deflected their gratitude. She had not done this alone. Thousands of people had contributed to keeping these memories alive. All she had done was sing a song one night at karaoke. But as she walked through the plaza, Emily understood that sometimes that was enough. Sometimes a single person taking a single action at the right moment could start something larger than themselves. Sometimes reaching back into history and pulling forward a forgotten truth could change the present in profound ways. She found a quiet corner of the plaza and looked up at the stars visible through the transparent dome overhead. Out there, across those vast distances, on worlds she would never visit, people were singing the hymn. Children were learning about the Battle of Crimson Fields. Humans were walking with pride in their species' history. Veterans of 100 species were finding solace in shared memory. Emily had spent her career building bridges. She had translated dead languages, analyzed cultural artifacts, traced connections across time and space. But this was her masterpiece. Not the archive, not the research, not even the documentary. Her masterpiece was the hymn itself, returned to life after 2 centuries, transformed from a forgotten military song into a living cultural force that brought different species together in remembrance and hope. She thought about the 300 soldiers who had sung these words as they ran into plasma fire 2 centuries ago. She wondered if they had any idea what they were creating. Probably not. They were just trying to find courage in the face of terror, to give meaning to their own deaths. But their choice, to sing in Latin, to reach back through history for a language that transcended their individual identities, had given their sacrifice a durability that personal heroism alone could never have achieved. Emily stood in that quiet corner for a long time, listening to the murmur of conversations around her, feeling the presence of thousands of beings sharing space in relative peace. This was what they died for. This plaza, this station, this civilization of different species coexisting and cooperating. This was the dawn that broke over Crimson Fields 200 years ago, and it was still rising. In the years that followed, Emily continued her work with the archive, but she also began training her successor. She knew that eventually she would retire, that the work would need to continue without her. She chose Jordan Pierce, who had grown from a passionate young researcher into a skilled historian and cultural diplomat. Jordan understood the work's importance and had the energy and vision to take it forward. Emily also made regular trips to different worlds, conducting workshops and lectures, always singing the hymn when appropriate. She became a familiar figure at Liberation War memorial ceremonies, always present but never dominating, supporting the real work of remembrance that belonged to the veterans and their descendants. She stayed in touch with Corvin until his death at the age of 214. She attended his funeral on the Valorian homeworld, where thousands gathered to honor one of the last survivors of Crimson Fields. At the funeral, Corvin's great-great-grandchildren sang the hymn of Final Dawn in perfect Latin, their young voices carrying the words that their ancestor had waited 2 centuries to understand. Emily wept through the entire ceremony. She realized that she had given Corvin something precious in his final years, the completion of a circle that had begun when he watched those human soldiers die, singing an incomprehensible song. He had died knowing what they sang, knowing why it mattered, knowing that the memory would outlive him. As Emily entered her 60s, she began to slow down. The constant travel took its toll. The emotional weight of the work, spending every day immersed in stories of trauma and sacrifice, began to exhaust her. She reduced her schedule, focused more on mentoring young researchers, spent more time simply writing and reflecting. She published her magnum opus in her 63rd year, a comprehensive cultural history of humanity's role in the Liberation War, combining rigorous scholarship with accessible narrative. The book became a bestseller across coalition space, taught in universities and read by millions of ordinary beings who wanted to understand the origins of the peace they enjoyed. Critics praised the book for its even-handedness. Emily did not shy away from documenting human failures and atrocities during the war. She showed the full complexity of the conflict, the moral compromises, the war crimes committed by all sides, including humans. But she also captured the heroism, the sacrifice, the moments when individuals transcended their limitations to do something truly noble. The book ended with a chapter about the hymn, tracing its journey from ancient Earth religious texts through the Battle of Crimson Fields to its modern revival. Emily argued that the hymn's power came from its refusal to simplify history. It acknowledged fear and death while still insisting on hope and meaning. It honored sacrifice without glorifying war. It was a mature response to trauma, neither suppressing the pain nor being consumed by it. When Emily was 68 years old, she received a message that surprised her. It came from Earth, from the University of New Boston, where she had worked before volunteering for the Cultural Exchange Program. They were offering her a position as a distinguished professor of galactic cultural history, with minimal teaching requirements and full support for her research. Emily had not been back to Earth in over 40 years. She had built her entire adult life in space, among aliens, focused on the galaxy beyond her homeworld. But the offer was tempting. She was tired. She wanted to spend her final years somewhere familiar, somewhere she could write and reflect without the constant demands of her public role. She accepted the position and began making arrangements to return to Earth. Her departure from the stellar crossroads was bittersweet. The station had been her home for more than 4 decades. She knew every corridor, every plaza, every quiet corner where she could escape the crowds. She had friends here from a dozen species, colleagues she had worked with for years, veterans she had interviewed countless times. The station organized a farewell ceremony that drew thousands of attendees. Emily stood on the same stage where she had first sung the hymn all those years ago and gave a short speech thanking everyone who had supported her work. She promised to stay connected, to continue her research, to train new generations of cultural historians who would carry the work forward. And then, at the end of her speech, she did something she had not done in years. She sang the hymn of Final Dawn one last time on the stellar crossroads stage. Her voice was older now, not as strong as it once was, carrying the weight of decades. But it was still clear, still true, still capable of conveying the meaning embedded in those Latin words. As she sang, she looked out at the crowd and saw them standing. Every being in the plaza, standing in respect and remembrance. Veterans and civilians, humans and aliens, young and old. All of them connected by this song, by the history it represented, by the sacrifice it honored. Emily finished singing and simply said, "They are remembered." And 10,000 voices responded, "They are remembered." She left the stage to thunderous applause, tears streaming down her face, knowing that this chapter of her life was ending, but that the work would continue. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks, plenty of time for Emily to process the transition she was making. She watched the familiar constellations shift as the ship moved through jump space, carrying her back toward the solar system that had birthed humanity so long ago. When Earth finally appeared in the viewport, a blue-green marble hanging against the black, Emily felt a surge of emotion she had not expected. This was home, not the home she had chosen or built for herself, but the deep home, the root home, the place where her species had emerged from primordial oceans to eventually reach the stars. She landed at the new Boston spaceport and was met by university officials and a surprising number of reporters. Word of her return had spread. She was something of a legend back on Earth, the historian who had spent 4 decades in alien space documenting humanity's role in galactic history. Earth's media had followed her work, had celebrated her achievements, had claimed her as a symbol of human cultural contribution to the wider galaxy. Emily endured the attention with practiced grace, answered the reporters' questions politely, and then escaped to the university campus as quickly as possible. The University of New Boston had changed dramatically in the 4 decades since she had left. The campus had expanded, new buildings rising in styles that incorporated alien architectural influences. The student body was more diverse, including several dozen alien exchange students. The faculty included humans who had spent years off-world and returned with new perspectives and methods. Emily settled into her new office, a spacious room with windows overlooking the old campus quad. She spent her first few weeks simply organizing her materials, setting up her workspace, reconnecting with old colleagues who had remained at the university. And she began to write. Not academic papers or historical analysis, but something more personal. A memoir of her 4 decades in space, focusing not on the big events, but on the small moments. The first time she tasted alien food, the late-night conversations with Valorian veterans, the feeling of singing the hymn at Crimson Fields, the friendships that transcended species boundaries. She wrote about what it meant to be human in a galactic context, how humans often felt inferior compared to species with thousands of years of spacefaring history, how the Liberation War history provided a foundation for human pride that did not depend on technological superiority or cultural dominance, how the simple act of honoring sacrifice could build bridges between radically different forms of life. The memoir took 3 years to write. Emily worked slowly, carefully, wanting to get every detail right, every emotional nuance captured. She interviewed dozens of people via long-distance communication, checking facts, gathering perspectives, ensuring that the story she told was true not just to her own experience, but to the collective experience of humans in space. She titled the memoir Dead Languages and Living Memory, One Historian's Journey Across Species Lines. The memoir was published when Emily was 72 years old. It became an instant bestseller, not just on Earth, but across human colonies throughout the galaxy. People responded to its honesty, its vulnerability, its refusal to present the author as some kind of hero. Emily positioned herself as someone who stumbled into significance, who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills to do something meaningful. Critics praised the memoir for its insights into cross-cultural communication and the role of history in shaping identity. Several universities adopted it as required reading for students in xenosociology and galactic studies programs. The chapter about singing at the karaoke night became particularly famous, excerpted and discussed endlessly in academic and popular media. Emily did not want to be famous. She had never wanted that. But she accepted it as a byproduct of doing work that mattered. She gave occasional lectures, accepted awards with appropriate humility, and supported young scholars who wanted to follow similar paths. But mostly, she just lived quietly on Earth, writing and reflecting, staying connected to her network of colleagues and friends across the galaxy. When Emily was 76, she received a message that brought her journey full circle. The Coalition Veterans Association was establishing a new memorial at the Stellar Crossroads, dedicated specifically to the 300 human soldiers who died at Crimson Fields. They wanted Emily to attend the dedication ceremony and, if she was willing, to sing the hymn one final time. Emily stared at the message for a long time. She was old now. The journey to the Stellar Crossroads would be difficult. Her voice was not what it once was. She tired easily. She had largely retired from public appearances. But this was important. This was the completion of the circle that had begun 50 years ago when she nervously stepped onto a karaoke stage and sang a song in a dead language. She accepted the invitation. The journey to the Stellar Crossroads was long and exhausting. Emily traveled with a human assistant, a young woman named Claire Dawson, who helped manage the logistics and physical demands of the trip. Claire was endlessly patient, ensuring Emily was comfortable and healthy throughout the journey. When they arrived at the station, Emily was astonished by the changes. The Stellar Crossroads had expanded dramatically in the years since she left. The population had tripled. New sections had been built. The old karaoke plaza was now one of several entertainment districts. But the core of the station remained familiar. Emily walked through corridors she remembered, past shops and restaurants that had been there decades ago. And she saw the memorial. The Coalition Veterans Association had constructed it in a prominent location, a beautiful space that combined architectural elements from all the species that fought in the Liberation War. At the center of the memorial was a wall of polished stone inscribed with the names of the 300 humans who died at Crimson Fields. Each name was accompanied by a small holographic display that showed the soldier's face and home city on Earth. The dedication ceremony drew thousands. Emily stood before the memorial, her aged body supported by Claire, and looked at those 300 faces. They were so young. Most had been younger than she was when she first sang their song. They had given everything for people they had never met, for worlds they would never see free. Emily sang the hymn of Final Dawn for the last time. Her voice was thin and wavering with age, but every word carried the weight of 50 years of devotion to their memory. Around her, thousands of voices joined in perfect Latin, 3 generations of beings who had learned the song because of her work. When she finished, Emily placed her hand on the memorial wall and whispered a promise that only the stone could hear. She promised that their names would never be forgotten, that their sacrifice would echo across centuries, that the dawn they died to bring would continue rising. The crowd saluted, every species in their own way, united in remembrance. Emily returned to Earth shortly after. She lived quietly for 7 more years, continuing to write and mentor young historians until her body finally gave out at age 83. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by friends and colleagues who had become her chosen family. Her funeral was attended by representatives from 47 species. They came from across the galaxy to honor the woman who had reminded them all that memory matters, that sacrifice should never be forgotten, that a single voice singing truth can change the world. At her funeral, a multi-species choir sang the hymn of Final Dawn in perfect Latin. The voices of human and alien blended together, just as Emily had always hoped they would, carrying forward the promise she had kept for 5 decades. Emily Parker was buried on Earth, but her legacy lived across the stars. The hymn she had rescued from history continued to be sung at memorial ceremonies throughout Coalition space. The archive she built continued its work, preserving the cultural memory of the Liberation War for future generations. The bridges she built between species remained strong. And on a distant world called Valoris Prime, on Crimson Earth that had once been soaked with blood, children of a dozen species learned to sing together in a dead human language, honoring sacrifice they had never witnessed, keeping alive memory they had inherited, proving that some promises transcend death itself. They were remembered. They would always be remembered. Emily had made certain of that. And that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.